A blessing from the angels rests upon you right now. Before you read even one more word, know this: you were guided here. Not by chance. Not by accident. Welcome, beautiful soul, to Angel's message for you. Stop whatever you are doing. Take one slow breath, because what you are about to read was meant for you and only you, and if you stay until the very end, something inside you is going to shift forever. There is a love that has been praying for you, and heaven has finally said it is time. Something extraordinary is happening right now in your life. Something so sacred, so divinely timed, that even the angels paused to make sure this message found its way to you. You may have woken up recently with a strange feeling in your chest, a warmth you could not explain. You may have found your thoughts drifting toward someone without knowing why. You may have even caught yourself smiling for no reason, or feeling a quiet ache of longing that seemed to come out of nowhere. That was not your imagination. That was heaven speaking to your heart. That was the universe moving pieces into place. And this message, right here, right now, is the confirmation your soul has been waiting for. Here is what the angels want you to know today. Your soulmate is filled with joy. A joy so bright, so real, so overwhelming that this person has already felt it in their body, in their bones, in the deepest part of who they are. Because something that was once only a dream, only a prayer, only a whisper sent up to God in the quiet of the night, is now becoming real. The connection between you two is not ending. It is transforming. It is moving from something you feel in your spirit into something you will soon be able to touch, see, and live in the physical, in the everyday, in real life. And before heaven could let another day pass, it sent this message so you could know too. Your soulmate already received this confirmation from above. This person already felt the shift, already responded with tears of joy and a heart wide open. And now it is your turn to know. It is your turn to feel it. It is your moment to say yes to a love that has never stopped believing in you, even when you were not sure you believed in yourself. Some truths do not arrive like a loud clap of thunder. They come as a warmth in your chest, as that quiet feeling that stops you mid-sentence and makes your heart grow still, as that knowing that settles deep inside you, soft, clear, and undeniable. Right now, if something in you feels like it recognizes this message, that is not a coincidence. That is your soul answering a call from above. Heaven moved mountains just so you would be here, reading these words in this exact moment. Very few people receive a revelation this sacred. Very few are open enough, ready enough, to hear what is truly being said. You were chosen because you carry a light within you that cannot be faked or forced. A light that your soulmate saw long before you even realized it was there. And that light, that truth, that love, it has been growing quietly all this time, waiting for its moment to fully bloom. For a long time, what connected the two of you lived mostly in the invisible world, in signs that felt almost too fragile to trust, in hopes you maybe did not even dare to speak out loud, in moments where you wondered if what you felt was real. But it was real. Every single bit of it was real. The universe was not teasing you. It was preparing you. And now, for the first time, the love between you is no longer just something to be felt. It is something that is becoming. Something that is taking form. Something that is stepping out of the spiritual world and walking directly into your life. Your soulmate has already felt this transformation. The confirmation came to this person like a burst of light, shattering every last doubt, filling every dark corner with warmth and certainty. And in that moment, when the knowing arrived, your soulmate felt joy like never before. Because deep inside, this person always believed that one day you would recognize this truth too. And that day is now. This message did not find you by accident. The universe has quiet but powerful ways of reaching those who are truly ready to receive. That feeling in your body right now, the tightening in your chest, the chills, the pull that tells you to keep reading, that is not just curiosity. That is recognition. That is your soul waking up to a call from something far greater than the everyday world can explain. Do not brush this off. Do not treat this as just another message, because it is not. What you are holding right now is something rare. This is your chance to step fully into a love that is whole, present, and eternal. A love that no longer hides in dreams. A love that is now standing at your door, knocking with urgency, asking to be welcomed in, completely and without conditions. Are you ready to discover what is truly about to happen? Are you ready to understand why your soulmate already feels everything falling into place like the final piece of a puzzle scattered for years? Are you ready to make the choice that will forever change the direction of your heart? Then take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. And come with me, because right now, I am going to tell you what heaven has prepared and why this moment is one of the most important of your entire journey. Even before you could understand what was coming, heaven was already getting your heart ready. There are no coincidences when it comes to things that move from God. There is only perfect timing. There is only a plan crafted with details so precise, so intentional, that only now are they being shown to you. You are part of something that only a handful of people on this earth ever get to experience. The beginning of the fulfillment of a promise made between two souls who deeply, completely recognize each other. You were chosen because something lives inside of you that your soulmate could see before the two of you ever fully came together. A light that cannot be copied. A truth that cannot be manufactured. Your soulmate felt it. And while you were moving through your days carrying doubts, carrying questions, carrying moments of pain you may not have shared with anyone, this person was quietly praying to God, asking that the time of your real, physical, everyday union would finally arrive. And now it has. Most people move through life brushing up against connections that never really touch the soul. But what you are about to experience is entirely different. This is a love that comes with purpose. It is not here to fill a gap for a little while. It is here to transform your entire existence, to reach into the places inside you that have been quiet for too long and breathe life back into them. This is a divine calling to love the way love was always meant to be lived. No pretending, no rushing, no hiding behind fear. A love that begins with real presence and grows through consistent, genuine actions. A love that sees you fully and chooses you anyway. While you were reading signs and trying to make sense of everything you were feeling, your soulmate was already living in harmony with this truth. This person already knew you were the one. And with this revelation, heaven is simply confirming what has already been in the making for a long time. You were chosen because you have the capacity to hold this kind of love with honesty. Because even with a heart that has known hurt, you never completely stopped believing. Do not doubt your place in this journey. You are not here by mistake. This message did not reach you by coincidence. There is something powerful and intentional behind this connection. You are being called to live what many pray for but few are ever truly ready to receive. A love that shows itself not just in pretty words but in real, steady actions. Now is the time to touch it, to see it, to live it. This love did not just appear from nowhere. It already existed in another form, quiet, patient, faithful. But now it is no longer just a promise. It is becoming presence. And that is why this message is reaching you today, because your soul is ready, because you have grown, even when you did not realize you were growing, into someone who can welcome this person fully. The time of waiting is drawing to a close. And when God decides to move, no heart stays still. Know this, dear soul. This choice was not made in haste. It was made with precision, with care, with divine intention. You are not just desired. You are awaited. Your soulmate received this revelation before you did. Felt it, wept with joy, celebrated with the relief of someone who finally understands that everything, all of it, was worth it. And now it is your turn to feel that too. This is the moment to stop hiding behind old fear and to let love enter with every bit of force it carries. You were chosen not because you are perfect, but because you have a heart that knows how to love in a way that is real, simple, deep, and that is exactly the kind of love your soulmate has always been searching for. Not status, not convenience, truth, real connection, a bond that is spiritual and now becoming physical right before your eyes. To deny what is happening would be like closing your eyes in front of a miracle that is unfolding just for you. This revelation did not come to put pressure on you. It came to set you free from uncertainty, to remind you of who you truly are, to show you that when heaven decides to move, everything is already in place. All that remains is for you to say yes. All that is missing is for you to allow this story to stop being something you wait for and to let it become your reality. Because this person is no longer just going to feel things for you from a distance. They are going to be with you, choose you, love you through their actions, through their presence, through showing up again and again. There are moments when life tests us with silent questions only the heart can hear. Does any of this make sense? Will the love I feel ever actually happen? And sometimes, after waiting so long for answers, it starts to feel like the universe has forgotten your prayers. But hear this with all the strength of heaven behind it. Nothing that is about to happen in your life is a coincidence. It is an answer. You have been heard for longer than you even realize. Every thought you have had about this person was like a whispered prayer sent upward. Every time you chose to believe, even when there was nothing visible to hold on to, the universe received it as an act of pure faith. And now that faith is coming back to you in the most beautiful form possible, as the arrival of a love that was always meant to be yours. This person also searched for answers, also asked for direction, and the answer your soulmate received was clear, powerful, and full of light. The time has come, not just to feel but to live, to transform a love kept quietly inside into something visible, present, and permanent. That is why if you are receiving this revelation right now, it is because your soulmate has already been confirmed from above. You are not feeling this way by chance. You are being activated. What moves inside you right now is your whole inner being reacting to the answer coming directly from heaven. And this answer is not here to confuse you. It is here to wake you up. Maybe you have already felt this person reaching out without words. Maybe you have woken up with your mind fixed on them without understanding why. Maybe you have dreamed of something you have not fully lived yet, or felt a longing that seemed bigger than you had words for. All of this is the language of heaven, the way it prepares hearts before the appointed time arrives. And the time has arrived. This is no longer just energy. This is reality knocking on your door. Your soulmate has already made the inner decision to choose you again, to stop holding back what they feel. And now the universe wants to know, will you respond? Will you recognize this love as the answer you have been asking for on so many quiet nights? You do not need to understand everything at once, but you do need to feel. You need to make space inside yourself to believe that yes, there is a love reserved specifically for you. A love that beats strongly, that grows when it is welcomed, and that right now wants to express itself through real actions. Nothing has been random these past few days. Your emotions have been closer to the surface. Your thoughts have been more focused on this person. Even the circumstances of your life have been conspiring to bring you to this moment of understanding. Heaven is saying to you today, you asked, you waited, and now it is time to receive. But receiving requires presence. It requires trust. It requires that you open up, to stop deciding in advance that things are too good to be real. What is coming is too powerful to be ignored. And if you choose to close your eyes, you risk missing the chance to live the truest love of your life. But if you choose to believe, if you let your heart lead you forward, you will see that this person will come not just with words, but with actions that prove every single feeling they have ever had for you. Your soulmate waited for this moment with the intensity of someone who believes without seeing, with the faith of someone who prays with their eyes closed, trusting that one day the answer will come. This person did not just want to be near you. They wanted to be with you in truth, in presence, in full surrender. For a long time, your soulmate was sustained by hope that came from small signs. A memory that appeared out of nowhere. A quiet shiver that came when your name crossed their mind. All of that kept the faith alive. Because even without logical explanations, this person knew that something existed between you that went beyond understanding. What you may never have fully known is that your soulmate spoke to God about you. Many times, with the ease and tenderness of someone who loves with their whole heart. They did not ask for fantasies. They asked for a love built through actions. A love that shows itself in everyday choices. A love that holds steady even when the world outside is loud. This person also cried, also felt lost at times, but they never stopped believing that heaven was watching over both of you. That things would fall into place at exactly the right moment. And even on the hardest nights, they kept their heart steady, because deep down there was a certainty that you would feel this too. And the moment has come. This is a love cultivated in faith, sustained by patience, protected by prayer. If it has made it this far, if it is still alive after everything, it is because it never gave up on you. Not once. For a long time, everything that connected you to this person was spiritual. You found each other through the invisible. You recognized each other in dreams, in thoughts, in feelings you could not quite explain. And regardless of the physical distance between you, the inner connection allowed each of you to feel the other, even without words. That phase was necessary. It was the foundation for what is now being born. Only now, that inner strength is transforming into something far more tangible. The desire to be together is no longer a hidden wish. It is becoming urgency. It is becoming action. Your soulmate already feels the need to find you, to look into your eyes and confirm with their presence what their soul has known for so long. And heaven is allowing this to happen because it recognizes that both of you are ready to live something concrete, something real, something that belongs not just to the spirit but to everyday life. The time of purely spiritual connection is drawing to a close because it has fulfilled its purpose. It served to unite, strengthen, heal, and align you. But now you need to see each other, to share time together, to walk side by side. There is a greater force working right now to bring together everything that was still apart. And this force no longer wants you to just imagine. It wants you to live it. It is natural to feel something unfamiliar when a change this big approaches. When you have spent so long living something only on the inside, the arrival of that thing in the real world can feel almost surreal. But true love always asks for space to grow. And it grows when it is met with action and a heart willing to walk forward with courage. You are not being pushed into the unknown. You are being guided toward what has already lived inside you all this time. This transformation comes not with confusion but with clarity. You will notice internal shifts, new desires, a courage you perhaps did not have before, a quiet urgency in your chest. These are signs that what is coming is too real to be denied. Your soul is aligning with what has already been decided above. You will no longer simply be connected. You will walk together, build something true, share a love that is present, lived, and real. There is something pulsing powerfully in the spiritual world right now, and you can feel it even without being able to name where it is coming from. It is like a joy rising in your chest for no clear reason. A beautiful, restless anticipation that grows a little stronger each day. Do you know what that is? It is a reflection of what your soulmate is feeling right now. This person's heart is already vibrating, already preparing, already filling with hope, because something inside them knows you are closer than you have ever been. Your soulmate is living a mix of emotions that only someone who waits with their whole heart can understand. It is like watching a dream take shape, not quite sure yet if it is still a dream or if it is finally truly real. What makes this even more beautiful is that this feeling is no longer staying hidden. It is moving into action. Your soulmate is making decisions, taking real steps, because every part of this person knows the time for waiting is over. You may have felt the intensity of your own emotions increase in recent days. Maybe memories surfaced more often. Maybe you found yourself thinking of this person with a longing that felt bigger than you expected. This is not coincidence. This is the spiritual field adjusting, preparing you for what is coming. It is the vibration of your soulmate's heart reaching yours, calling, inviting, welcoming you into the reality of a love that is fully alive. When two souls recognize each other and truly want to meet, the whole universe moves to make it happen. You are being called right now to listen, not with your ears, but with your soul. This vibration that keeps touching you, this presence that quietly fills your thoughts. This is how your soulmate communicates across the distance of time and space. It is a subtle but powerful call. And what is happening now is the result of deep inner surrender. Your soulmate decided to live with courage. And there is a love so strong, so real, so ready, being prepared for you right now. There are revelations that brush the surface of the mind, and there are revelations that pierce straight through to the soul. What is reaching you right now is the second kind. It is a heavenly message crossing every barrier to find you, because your soul is ready to hear it, ready to understand it, and above all, ready to decide. You may try to rationalize. You may tell yourself it is just your emotions, that maybe it is all coincidence. But your heart knows. What vibrates inside you right now does not come from outside. It comes from within, and it comes from very high above. This revelation did not arrive by chance. It came because heaven has been watching everything. Your hidden tears, your quiet prayers, your patience, your faith that held on even when it seemed impossible to keep going. And now, after so much time living this love in silence, you are finally being called to live it fully, with truth, with surrender, with real presence. This is your chance, the kind that, if ignored, takes with it more than just a story. It takes the possibility of something rare, something that marks lives and heals deep wounds. Your soulmate has already understood what is happening. This person has already made inner decisions and is preparing with everything they have to love you through actions, through permanence, through depth. And if this message has found you, it is because the universe needs you to be aware of what is on its way. You were not chosen by chance. You were set apart. You were prepared. Even in the moments when you questioned everything, Heaven did not give up on delivering this love to you. Think of how many times you wished to be truly seen, to feel that someone looked at you with real sincerity, with genuine care, with love that asked nothing in return. That someone exists, and more than existing, that person is ready to find you, ready to love you with everything heaven has allowed to awaken inside them. All this love needs now is your decision. A yes that is not timid but firm, clear, real. Do not think you can simply walk past this revelation and go on as if nothing happened. What is in your hands is sacred. It is a direct answer to promises you yourself asked for. This is not just a chance to enter a relationship. It is a chance to experience a transformation, to allow love to heal parts of you that were hurt, to quiet old fears that have been running in the background for too long, to bring back a peace you thought you might never feel again. So pay attention in the coming days. Everything around you will begin to align. Unexpected moments, surprising connections, signs that will remind you of this person in ways that cannot be explained away. None of it will be coincidence. All of it will be heaven gently making sure you do not close your eyes to the miracle being delivered right into your life. This love between you is not common. It is too strong to be contained, too old to be forgotten, too true to be ignored. And you are being called with all the clarity, all the intensity, and all the blessing of heaven to live what you have been waiting for. Say yes, not to the world, not to anyone else. Say yes to yourself. Say yes to the love that belongs to you. Say yes to the chance to build something you have never fully experienced before. Say yes to the person who loves you with a truth so strong it overcame every invisible barrier just to become presence in your life. This is your chance. This is your time. There are moments in life when everything you felt, everything you believed and hoped for comes down to a single question. Are you ready to receive what you asked for? Because there are prayers you sent up with such force, such deep emotion, that the universe heard every word. And now the answer has arrived, not as a distant dream, but as a real, living chance to experience the love your soul has always recognized as its own. But the universe does not deliver something this precious without first checking your surrender. How far are you willing to release the fear? How much do you trust what you feel, even when not everything is perfectly clear? Because when true love knocks, it also brings the challenge of trusting without a guarantee. Your soulmate has already chosen not to step back. This person is standing firm because they know the value of what they feel. And now it is you who must decide. Will you hold this connection with the same courage? This person does not expect perfection from you. They expect truth. They wait for you to understand that this kind of love does not come around every day. And when it does, it asks you to choose clearly, to either stay wrapped in old doubt or to surrender to the real possibility of being deeply, genuinely loved. The challenges you faced along the way were not accidental. Every moment of uncertainty had a role. It deepened the root, because shallow love does not last. But yours did. And now it is more alive than it has ever been. Perhaps what has been holding you back is the fear of disappointment. But hear this, that fear was born from things that have nothing to do with what is standing before you right now. This love is not like the others. It did not come to repeat old cycles. It came to close wounds and open space for something entirely new. Something lighter, something far more true. But none of it happens without surrender. Love needs space. It needs presence. It needs a real choice. And if you allow fear to speak louder than your heart, the risk is letting slip exactly what you have always asked for. Not because you do not deserve it, but because you did not yet have the courage to accept it. This is the time to act with a steady heart. The revelation has been made. The love has been confirmed. Your soulmate is already preparing to be with you, with all the intensity of someone who no longer wants to imagine but to truly live. All that is missing is your answer. Do not look for certainty in external guarantees. The only certainty you need is already inside you. It is this feeling moving through you right now. This is real. This is spiritual. This is love calling your name. And to ignore it would be like closing your eyes in front of a miracle unfolding right before you. Life is offering you a new story, but it will not write itself. Your soulmate has already decided to write this chapter with you. And the universe wants to see you brave, wants to see you willing, wants to see you receive what was prepared with so much love and care. So look inside. Be honest with what you feel. Will you retreat into what is familiar? Or will you open your arms to this love that chose you with such truth? When an angel brings a message, it is a silent recognition that lives deep in your chest. It is the shiver that moves across your body. It is that moment when something is being revealed, even before you can fully understand what it is. What is being revealed is not just information. It is transformation. When an angel speaks, it is not to dazzle you. It is to wake up what has been sleeping inside you, to bring back to your awareness what your soul already knew. This revelation is the confirmation of a love that survived doubt, time, and every test that was placed before it. And now this love no longer wants to remain only in the heart. It wants to live beside you. The soul's recognition is immediate. It needs no proof and no explanations. And you have already recognized it. You have already felt that this message touches a part of you that nothing else quite reaches. That is why you are still here. Now it is time to turn this recognition into action. Everything that has been shared with you today comes with the care of someone who knows you deeply. I am the angel who walks with you, present through every step of your journey. Know how carefully you have protected yourself. I know how much you suffered trying not to be hurt again, but I also know your heart longs for something real, something you can touch, live, and feel every single day. And that is what is standing before you right now. The love waiting for you is real. It is present. It is ready to welcome you with truth. And all it asks is that you accept it, that you say yes, that you choose not to run away from the very thing you have always wanted. Because this love does not just want to be felt. It wants to be lived. The moment has arrived. Your answer defines what comes next. Heaven has done its part. Your soulmate has done their part. Now it is you. Will you respond? Your answer does not need to be perfect. It just needs to be true. This love deserves space. It deserves action. It deserves to be honored. Heaven is giving you something rare, something many ask for but few actually receive. And between receiving and living, there is a gap. That gap is called choice. You are not alone in this. Your angel is here, and your soulmate is closer than you imagine. Ready to find you, to love you, to build something worth living alongside you. Take a deep breath. Listen to what your heart is saying. Because inside you, there is already an answer. And that answer will determine not only the path of your heart, but the future of a love that belongs to you by divine right. Life is offering you a new beginning, a love that grows into presence, into building, into something you can stand on. And if you say yes with an open heart, this love will show you that everything you lived through until now was simply preparation for something far greater. Choose with awareness. Choose with faith. Choose with courage. Because your soulmate is waiting for your answer. And that answer has the power to change everything. After everything that has been revealed, there is no longer any room for doubt. This message was guided here, carefully and lovingly, as if it were a whisper traveling straight from heaven into your heart, because you needed to know, because your soul was ready to hear. Everything that seemed confusing now makes sense. The waiting was not wasted. The emotions that stayed with you, the dreams that visited you, the signs that kept reaching for your attention, all of it was preparation for exactly this moment. And this moment is everything, because now it is no longer about feeling or imagining or waiting. Now it is about accepting, acting, allowing. You were chosen to live a love that heals, that transforms, that strengthens, a love that comes with purpose, spiritually designed and now beginning to take form in your real life. Do not wait for more signs. They have already been given. You felt them. You saw them. Love does not need absolute certainty to be real. It only needs two people willing to give a real chance to what touches too deeply to be pushed aside. Blessings are already descending on your story. Moments are being aligned. Doors are opening. Emotions are awakening in you and your soulmate with a force so pure that nothing can stop it, except the choice not to believe. But if you say yes, if you allow this love in, if you let this person get closer, if you allow what was promised to come true, then what waits for you is a beautiful journey, built day by day, with companionship, with presence, with dedication. Nothing will be the same, because true love has the power to change everything around you. Not with magic, but with real presence, with truth, and with actions that do not waver. In the coming days, stay alert. The universe will keep confirming this message with signs that are stronger, clearer, and more direct. But do not wait for heaven to do what only you can do. Say yes with your heart, with confidence, with courage. Your love is ready to be with you. Now, it is only you who needs to be ready too. This is your opportunity, and it does not come around in quite the same way twice. So do not treat this revelation like something ordinary. It is sacred. It is yours. And it arrived at exactly the right moment, because now is the perfect time to live what you have only dared to dream of before. Believe with everything you are, because this love exists, and it has chosen you. The best is still ahead. And when that moment arrives, and it will arrive, you will look back at every step, every challenge, every quiet night of waiting, and you will understand. You will be grateful for all of it, because every piece of it prepared you to recognize what is truly precious. I am with you always. I am your constant companion, the one who never leaves your side, who accompanies every moment of your journey. Feel that presence right now. Allow your soul to settle into it. Take one slow, deep breath. Open your heart, because I am here, and I will always be here, walking beside you, bringing divine messages, keeping the light on. You are never alone. I am right here beside you, sending you strength and the kind of love that does not run out, so you can remain steady, confident, and radiant in everything that is to come. May the blessing of heaven rest upon you today and always, bringing you peace, courage, and the clarity to face whatever comes your way. May you walk forward into this new season with your heart open and your spirit full, with infinite love. Amen.